Hey everyone. Um, Great to see you. Eric, we've got you up, and then Sid, I'm bringing you up now. Super psyched for this. Very excited to have two great folks, Eric, who was Climate Vine 1.0, and Sid, who's been, part of the family for a while. Very, very brief intro, because as we always do, we just try to go as deep as we can, as quickly as we can. But Sid, you're a director of the investment team at Just Climate, and you wrote a book called The Case for Nature, which is a great book and something that we'll go deep into. Eric, you are program officer for nature finance at the Bezos Earth Fund. Both of you have done lots of other things, but we're just going to stick with what you are right now and that lens. And I guess first, just thanks for both being here.
Thanks for having us, Candace.
Of course. Okay, cool. So I think step one is I'm just gonna lay out some assumptions and some like some grounding, I guess, for everyone here so that again we can sort of jump in. And let me know if you both work with these assumptions or if you want to refine any of them. So the first one is natural ecosystems are important. And said in your words that they're priceless, but they also have value that we're not pricing into our current economy. And so as a result, the stewards of our land and our seas face the pressures of a market economy every day, right? Fishers might not want to fish as much as they are, but if they don't, they feel like someone else will. The second assumption is, and this is one that we've talked a lot, well, in some ways about in Climate Bind, we had Bill McKibben talk about this, right? Like different people who sort of are in different parts of the spectrum. But I think actually a fair amount of people that we bring in believe that it would be amazing to restructure our economy, to like start with first principles and just rebuild it. But that we may not be able to do that. One, that's like a very big project. And two, we may not be able to do it, if we can at all, in the timeline that we might need to make the climate impact that we're trying to make. And so we're assuming that we're actually working within the confines of the current economic structure and that there are ways to sort of bend that structure in positive ways, right? So that's sort of working assumption number two. Um, is there anything that you want to refine in either of those assumptions, or do they both sound good?
I think we have to accept both assumptions from my view.
Yeah,
We may not
great.
like them, but accept them.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Okay, great. And so I imagine that a lot of what we're going to talk about today, and I think most of what you two think about, is how do you think about so recognizing nature's value and using economic logic, right? So nature has value, economic logic, put it together, sort of a natural capital thing that happens out of that. And we're wanting to assign dollar values to the services that ecosystems provide. And so what I want to start with briefly, and this is where I want us to be brief, because again, everyone here agrees that like this is a problem, but there's a biodiversity and habitat loss problem. I think it's interesting to again briefly talk about like what is the core problem? Because we think about it as climate change, we think about it as agriculture, we think about it as using timber. But if you both had to kind of quantify like what are the biggest reasons that we have this biodiversity and habitat loss problem, to again sort of ground into how do we fix it if we understand what the problem is? So Eric, actually, let's start with you and then Sid will go after.
All right, I'm taking my Bezos Earth Fund hat off
Right.
and I'm entering into a Chatham House for the
Yes.
purposes of this conversation. I mean, if we really want to talk about what's at the core of this, we have an economic system that is designed to achieve continual growth within a, ecological system that cannot permit, indefinite growth. And so I think that's at the root of it. Now, I think there are forms of economic growth that could and should happen that fit in alongside kind of functioning within our ecological realm and boundaries. And I think those are the kind of systems that I like to think about is how can you have continual maybe growth, but not necessarily physical or material growth, but growth in other ways within human society. So I'll put out that high level reflection to start and pass it over to Sid.
Yeah, I know, Eric. Same, I'm taking the hat off. It's really interesting because I think there's a different strand I've been thinking about, which relates to what you just said. I think we have an economic system that is actually very good at what it does. It's extremely hard to build systems that are as complex as the ones we use every day to get food on our tables or move around the world or get energy to, heat our homes. It works extremely well, but it optimizes for one thing. And that one thing is, economic return for every dollar invested and kind of more broadly economic growth. We made that choice and we've mostly achieved that. But I think the even harder, and of course that's come at the cost of the environment more generally and biodiversity specifically. But if you think about politics today in an era of what I'm going to call kind of slowing or uncertain growth, not degrowth, not decline, but slowing per capita GDP growth, you have incredible ruptures in the system we've set up from a social perspective. So I'm even less convinced that we can survive a period of degrowth politically. And so, Eric, what you're describing makes a lot of sense to me. It's something to try and aim for, which is build models that can actually deliver sustainable economic growth within planetary boundaries.
Love that. So I've been listening, for better or worse, to this guy named Nate Higgins who talks about the Great Simplification, which is a lot about, see, Eric, you maybe are familiar.
Very well. I have an old story about Nate, but I won't get into that.
Okay, great. We should talk about it offline. But a very common thing, and people say this all the time, is like infinite growth in a finite world is not going to work. And we might be hitting against some of those, like you said, planetary boundaries. And so let's actually just start there, which is what does economic growth, and this is still high level, but what does economic growth that's maybe not as tied to physical things or supply chains or however you would define that, Eric, since you're the first one to say it, what would that look like? And maybe what are examples of maybe smaller communities or people or organizations that have been able to do some of that, if that's even there, but in whatever way you can paint a picture for us, please do.
Yeah.
And so Eric first.
I mean, I have not done nearly enough thinking about this, and there are far better thinkers. Some of the folks that Nate has had on his podcast are these thinkers. Where to begin? I think within kind of our current economic system, it's a question of what are the things that have value that are not being valued. So this is a lot of what Sid and I think about today is like, is there a way to create a system such that when water is produced, the land steward that's producing that water gets paid for producing the water, right? Water is largely valued at the point of consumption. Right now, it's not valued at the point of production. Like that's kind of the low-hanging fruit for me. And ecologically, it's actually simpler. I actually think we think that the stuff that we're working on is the hardest. I actually think it's maybe the easiest place to start, which is where the ecology is producing something that humans are dependent on or need to consume. We can at least start to value those things and encourage growth of those things. Now, how do you do that in a way where you're not privatizing a public good or you're like quasi-privatizing it, but maintaining the fundamental like land and ownership rights with the land steward is a whole nother piece of the puzzle, as we've all kind of seen with carbon credits and other kind of units like that. But I think that's the kind of like honestly lowest hanging fruit to at least start to incentivize the production of something that we do depend on that's within, we can have kind of growth. Now, on the consumption side, this is one that I haven't really cracked and that somebody just tossed into the chat, like how do you kind of value, and build human growth instead of just kind of physical or material growth. And I think that's a great question. When I was in grad school, after I finished grad school, I went and hung out with Sid at the GSB and just tried to launch a mental health startup for a year on a whole thesis around consumption and mental health. Or if we address mental health, we address consumption drivers. And it kind of ties back into this question, which is essentially, is there a way to economically value human development, human kind of not spiritual growth, but like self-development. And I do not have a model for that. And within like a capitalistic system, like how do we value social capital and human capital? Really interesting questions that I do not quite have answers to.
Sid, do you want to bring in the answers? I'm just joking. I know these are big questions, but how would you answer the like again, painting as much of a picture of what this would look like. And so, Eric, you brought in, I think, a core thing that both of you think about, which is just price nature, price ecological systems. And then and that's actually the easy part, like you said, Eric, and then figure out how to do some of the rest. What would you add to that? And are there examples of, again, communities, organizations doing that well, or is it, do we have to sort of re-envision this from scratch within the current economic system?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I think there are different ways to think about where to start and where to end. I think those can be different places. Eric kind of described the middle bit, I think. The end is a complete rethinking of the system and what we value. The middle bit is pricing or kind of at least economically valuing specific parts of the natural services that we get currently for free. The start, I think, and this is something I spend a lot of time in my day job, is to look at systems that are currently extractive and damaging for nature and look at ways to replace the fossil-based, often highly toxic ways of doing business with ways that are cleaner and faster and cheaper and better, and usually based on biology. So whether that's replacing chemical pesticides with biological pesticides or looking at kind of business models that can help turn waste of all sorts into kind of valuable products, so we actually value more of the inputs, all the way through to models that can help grow high quality, carbon storing, nature positive food products within agricultural systems that are actually then able to pay higher prices for that. So all of that stuff is, I think, where in some ways where you start, where you don't necessarily need to directly price the environmental service that is currently unpriced. You simply use the thing that we are paying for and deliver a better, faster, cheaper, high quality version of that thing. And in doing so, reduce the pressure on nature. And I think back to your framing, Candice, it's really important to remember agriculture drives 92% of deforestation, right? And a lot of that agriculture is, all that deforestation is happening because we've lost hundreds of millions of hectares of productive agricultural land across the world to degradation from conventional ag. So all of these things are linked. And so I think you can do quite a lot to remove pressure on nature simply by restoring degraded land and making it possible to grow healthy food using inputs that are safer and better for nature. So that's where I'd start. And then the next step, I think, is exactly what I described.
Cool. Okay. So I'm going to repeat that as, and I like that really, really tangible example of like where we're starting or where Just Transition or you sit is choosing to start, are choosing to start is in replacing some of the things that have degraded agriculture and land, right? To things that are better. And they have to be cheaper, better, faster, right? For like this current economic system to actually start using them at a scale that makes a big enough difference, right? But it's actually, replacing chemical pesticides with biological pesticides. That's where you're starting. The middle is pricing nature. And then that piece, Eric, that again, like I think is really important is figuring out how to do it well, right? How to not totally privatize it, how to not make it the carbon market sort of like space, right? And then the end is rethinking the system. Eric, do you have like, is that the similar frame that you work in, or are you thinking about it differently? Because I don't think, and just to sort of allow for maybe, differing views, like I don't know that anyone has figured out like this is how we do systems change, right? Like we have to start in the same place and we have to end at the same place. Do you sort of poke at it from a different part of the cycle?
Yeah, no, I think Justin Adams is a good friend of both Sid and myself, and the twin trails kind of analogy that he uses, I think, is the one that I largely take, and I'll add another dimension onto it. But the twin trails is essentially you're doing the kind of short-term incremental while you're also thinking about like planting the seed for the longer term thing that might kind of be able to come up or fill in where the current system starts to break. And you actually need, I think often people who have the privilege to be in these rooms and have these conversations argue about which one we should do. And I actually think we need to do both and we need them talking to each other. And the other dimension that so that's kind of like the temporal dimension, if you will. The other dimension that I'll put on it is like, where's your intervention point within the system? And this is another place where I think we have folks that either say we need to do top-down big systems like UN type change, or the only thing that's worth doing at all is grassroots. And this is, again, where I actually think we need to be doing both at the same time, and we need them actually talking to each other. And I will say the forces that have done this really well that are working against us, you've seen how they've done that grassroots bottom up really well with the top down and had them meet in the middle, which is largely where we are today. And that's something that I think our movement in general can stop the infighting and actually be like, we need both of these and we need to work together on them.
Yeah, I was
And it's
just
random.
talking to
Sorry,
go
go ahead.
Sid.
No,
No,
you
no,
go.
no. No, I'm interviewing you. This is when you talk, I stop. Keep going.
Fine. But please go after. Eric, I went to go see Kyoto, the play in London a few weeks ago.
Mm.
Um, with David, who's one of the founders of Generation, and a bunch of others who've been watching this space for a very long time. And I think it's meant to be hopeful. It's a play about the Kyoto Protocol, the run up to it, kind of the oil lobby groups that were active, and then it's centered around a single lobbyist, who is incredibly influential, based on a true story. I think it's meant to leave you hopeful, but anyone who's been following this leaves pretty depressed, I think, because what you learn is there were moments where things could have been different, but exactly the dynamic you're describing of the kind of entrenched hobby groups being incredibly well organized, both at the highest levels and bottom up, is something that hasn't been replicated, because I think it does involve capturing systems of power in a way that people are uncomfortable with, and that's something we have to confront, right? Because everything we're describing, you and me, Eric, is about working within the system and playing fair and playing nice. And that's not always sometimes that doesn't work, but I still believe I want to do that, but I can see why there's limits to that.
I want to riff. Can I riff on that, Candace, for a second? Because
Oh
this
my
is,
God,
I'm
please.
now going to get a
Yes.
little bit like, first, I had my bachelor party last week in Puerto Rico, and we played Survivor. And I had this fascinating reflection that I promise ties directly back into what Sid said, which is like, there are ways to actually win the game, but have everybody in the group be like, that was a lame, boring, kind of annoying way to win the game. Like you were kind of like
Mhm.
you didn't do the like heroic thing, or like you didn't do the like harder road. You kind of like just took the easy one and you were kind of mean and whatever. And the people who did that actually ended up losing at the end of the day, because then the jury votes at who wins. And the people who like took the hard road and like did the hard yards and won kind of the right way were the ones that were selected. And I'm personally really struggling this right now because Sid, like I completely agree with you. Like the only way to really move things in this world is to build power. But I do think that if we build power in the wrong way, no matter what comes out of it, if we do it kind of from a place of like kind of bad, or like trying to like shortcut or harm others or do whatever, ultimately that thing will also fail and die. And so I think thinking about like how is it that you can, and I mean this is like social, movements 101, like how is it that you can build like genuine, authentic power, um, is like the big question that I'm sitting with that I don't have a great answer to, but have been doing a lot of Joanna Macy time, so hopefully learning.
And Twin Trails, who was that from? I missed the name.
Justin Adams.
Okay.
That's by the Emberpyrum Center, right? I think they came up with it. It's like a
Yeah.
retreat center in Dartmoor.
Excellent. Well, I was just thinking, I spoke to my friend Sanjay yesterday, and he was like, who on the left is like, we're the philanthropists, actually, right? And basically, as you said, the right has been really good at just so many thoughts. One thought is like Bill Gates could like buy elections, right? And then not have to put as much money into healthcare or environmental things. And like, obviously he knows this, and he's made a choice to maybe do a different route, maybe because capturing systems of power is not as comfortable to the left and to trying to play fair. But then, yeah, we're the philanthropists right now to step in. And if we had like $5 billion over the next few years, which is not a ton of money, and we started playing that bottom up, top down game, we'd have to do some catching up. And I say we, meaning like people that care about nature and the environment and climate, I think generally would have to be playing catch up. But one example was Hewlett Organization, which a few years ago, I forgot, Larry Kramer maybe was the head of it, president of it. And he's put out this like sort of tear down of philanthropy as a system, just being like, we are not thinking long term. We're just always playing defense. We actually should be doing what, again, more of the sort of anti-climate people are doing, which is decide that we're going to go a certain route and do it for 50 years and just commit to it and not stray as things go up and down or get better or worse. And then, I think he left, and in the last few years, they were like, actually, we have a reorg and we're totally shifting what we're doing. So to actually hear you saying, Eric and Sid are instead of like playing shortcuts and playing rough and wrong, maybe, right? Which I don't think anyone wants to do. It's more about just thinking long term and being able to build power in that way that is maybe fair and square, right? I don't know what that even means right now, but like, but in a way that feels ethical enough to build that power and to not stray away from it versus like brute forcing it, maybe, is what I heard is sort of a middle ground between what the two of you just said. Any other thoughts on that sort of high level, how to build power, and maybe, well, maybe just one last question on this, which is, what are your hopes, right? Like, Eric, I know you took off the Bezos hat, but like from a philanthropic or corporate or whatever sort of lens you want to take, like, how do you want people or organizations to step up right now? And Sid, back to you, and then we'll go back into like pricing nature and some of those things. But let's stay here for just one more beat.
Yeah, I mean, I think people are scared, I think people are really scared right now, and it's across the board, in all kind of spaces of society, from philanthropy to government to the corporate world. And I guess what I've seen, and like myself, like I like, have anxiety like the rest of us, or well, maybe the few that don't have it, like, man, I'm jealous. Like, you've won. But that is a thing that like I feel it, and when I get strong, and I remember like I taught physics in Mozambique in the Peace Corps coming out of undergrad, and I remember one time going into a class and I had a panic attack, like a full-on panic attack, and it was like I did, like, lost the ability to function, and fortunately, like, interacting with my students kind of brought me back. But it was wild how, in that moment of like fear and panic, you just lose any semblance of rationality. Like, it all goes out the window. And what I'm trying to do and failing most days is like, how do I bring back a like core of hope and love to just be the like the battery that's like keeping me going. And I do think a lot about like, is it possible for us to do anything from a point of fear? And so my like first principles with a lot of this is like, honestly, how do we bring people? I don't know if I mentioned your question, Candace, but I'm riffing on this now. Like, how do we bring people back into a like space of just at least like a day or two a week being able to be kind of driven and motivated by love and hope, and being an opportunistic kind of headspace? Because fear just collapses the like Overton window essentially. And is there a way that we can keep that as big and broad as possible in a time when, as things get worse and worse, there will be more and more unique opportunities to bring new things in and new things into the table? So I have like I honestly have very few answers as to like how to actually operationalize any of this. I'm still working on like the foundational, like, how do I have the heart space and the head space to just show up and like hopefully come up with some pathway forward. So yeah, that's kind of where I'm at. Sid?
I think it's beautifully said, Eric. What gives me hope, I think, is that there are lots of people who've never had the privilege of having like free money given to them, or VC hype cycles. I meet a lot of people who are completely outside the bubble, and they're very inspiring because you speak to farmers in Brazil and they're like, yeah, we never got any free money. It's always been hard. And I think for plenty of people in the world, the fear comes from having something taken away, the uncertainty, the disappointment. There are plenty of people who have nothing or very little and actually live pretty happy lives, and are willing to work on this stuff. And what they need is a small incentive or some new way of doing something. But I think we have incredible numbers of willing volunteers to the cause who live on the front lines of climate change and the nature crisis, right? So they actually suffer the consequences more than the people on this call do, probably. And so I think that's what gives me hope. It's like there are all of those people don't, they're not looking at the news. They're not doom scrolling New York Times and saying, "Oh my gosh, life is." This is really funny. I spoke to someone who used to work for my grandma when I was in India a couple of weeks ago, and I asked her how she's feeling about the news, and she was like, "What are you talking about?" And I told her, and she said, "Oh yeah, yeah, like that's far worse things have happened, and you're too young to remember. But also you have no idea what life is like for most people. So And she's right. So I think that keeps me very grounded, and it may seem bad, but it's been very bad for a lot of people, and there's still a lot of hope there.
I mean, I think both of those, one, thanks for being so honest about how you're feeling and how you're actually doing. Because I think, I mean, I can definitely relate. And Eric, one, congrats on the bachelor, I forgot to say, or bachelor party. I forgot to say that in the wedding upcoming. But two, both of what you said, well, mostly what you said reminded me of something that my friend Willow of Atmos, which is this like beautiful organization and magazine, has often said about hope, which is like, if your grandma is crossing the street and you see a bus, you're not like, oh my God, do I hope that she is going to live or not? No, you just like go and you grab her and you move her out of the way of the bus. And I try to think about that a lot in terms of my own, anxiety and fear about all of this is, I think, twofold. Sid, like my family's from a tiny village in northern Iraq that has gone through, and they're Catholic, right? Like they've gone through like some things I definitely have not. And the way that I sort of think about climate and nature right now is not so far off from the grandma walking in front of a bus. Like I have that sort of like, for better or worse, like I think somewhat realistic or understanding of just where we're at in the cycle of time, and trying to just ground into who am I and what can I be doing right now? Like I can't literally stop the bus, and I think we started there, right? Like we can't fundamentally change the economic system, but what can we be doing, and how do we do that together? Any final thoughts about that before we dig into nature capital?
But what are the no regrets actions? I think a lot about that. Like under any future scenario, what are the actions that I can take today that will contribute to, betterment in some way, shape, or form? So I think that's, the framing that I use, but everybody will have their own kind of answer and, thought exercise within that.
I think the one that everyone that I've spoken to so far has agreed on is like community, especially in person and in sort of where you are. Okay, so I think all of this is actually really helpful and sort of feeds into what can we do right now, right? Like where are the levers of change that you all see? And so Sid, obviously with Just Transition and the sort of investment space, I know that you all are investing in, monitoring biodiversity, in, like you said, those better pesticides so that we can improve agriculture. If we're going to still do it in an industrial way, let's at least do it in a slightly better industrial way. Eric, we've talked about getting maybe corporations on board, right? And that being a sign of hope. But in your own words, where are you focusing right now when you are in the space of what can I be doing right now, and where are the levers of change? And Sid, why don't you go first this time?
And there were two questions in the kind of, is it what can we do right now?
Oh yeah, sorry. What can we do right now? And I think paired with that is, what are the levers of change, right? Like where are you really focused? And be as specific as you want to who you are and your own background, or you can take it to that sort of larger background, but like where are the places that you can put a finger and actually make some change?
Yeah, I mean, I want to go back to the kind of really short-term stuff, which is not transformative, but it's actually, it's not slightly better, it's actually dramatically better on some indicators. And so to give you an example, um, we recently invested in a company called Greenlight Biosciences, and they've been going for 12 years. I would say it's a fairly, unloved given the history, but they've been commercializing something that's incredibly cool. It's sprayable RNA for pesticides. We use RNA for the COVID vaccine, worked very well. Problem is it's really expensive. What they ended up doing was focusing on ag applications by bringing down the cost of manufacturing in a way that is, I won't get into details, but it's a cell-free process, no toxic byproducts, and really, really, really cheap. They finally got that approved last year, and as part of the kind of growth story, we came in to help them scale to new markets and so on. The product is amazing. It's a hyper-targeted pesticide that only targets the pest of interest and uses its own cell machinery to essentially either damage or kill it. Zero off-target effects for biodiversity, and zero off-target effects for humans, because again, huge amounts there's human health consequences to the food system and chemical pesticides in there. And the best part is it works in a system that doesn't value soil microbiota, like soil microbiology or fungal diversity or frankly even human health, but it does value yield. and it does value productivity. And so what they're saying is, given the decades long, and the founder is an amazing, inspiring guy called Andre, and he kind of came into this because his son had an autoimmune condition from exactly the sort of thing that the food system creates. But what he ended up doing with this is saying we can do this and restore yields back to what it used to be before pesticide resistance took over in many places and in many specific crops, right? So we've ignored nature and we've kind of dumped, it was almost like nuclear bombing fields across the world for generations. You have huge amounts of resistance. And there are now ways where biology can be much better than chemistry, right? And again, there's a long way to go that needs to scale, lots of risks. I mean, of course, it's not an obvious bet. But it's not a venture bet, right? Because actually past the venture stage, they're in deployment, they're growing, they need a lot of help and capital. But I see that as a really promising solution because our food system should be leveraging things like that use biology rather than fossil chemistry, and can actually help sustain. We will need some pesticides to grow food, right? That is true, particularly the scale that we need to feed 9 billion people. But we can do it in a way that is kind to the rest of the biodiversity that exists and does it better than essentially outcompetes approaches that we invented 100 years ago, right? So that's a very, very specific example of a lever where, and there are multiple levers like that in the food system. There are multiple levers in and around the food system, around ecosystem restoration and so on. I think there's interesting things around water use efficiency. Again, huge problem. It's a now problem, right? It's not a hypothetical. And you may not value, again, you might not value water as a production source, but you value crop yields and you value urban resilience and you value industrial production. So I think the principle behind all this is understand what you value, see where that's dependent on functioning ecosystems and nature in some form, and then fix that problem so you continue valuing the thing, but you do it in a way that actually helps benefit nature. So that's one framing. It does mean a lot of stuff that we should be doing is out of scope because that requires a direct, like standing forest, for example. We don't want to be creating huge amounts of economic activity there. Frankly, we want to leave them alone and allow the people who steer those landscapes to decide what they want to do. But so this approach doesn't give you easy answers for that, but it does at least allow you to where there is a market economy, where there are big companies working in the space and sourcing things and growing things and selling things, we can make that function in a different way. I think that's my only point.
Yeah, and this is what Sid and I are he's the conservation biologist, so he focuses on biology. I'm the environmental engineer who studied water for, too long. So I think about water a lot. And so to Sid's point, well, briefly on the kind of how we can do it better instead of kind of over engineering in the ways we've done or kind of using chemistry. Like I was looking at cacao in the southern Amazon, and I went to a farm. One was they had planted the new kind of drought resistant species monoculture style, and the other they used the old species but did it in an agroecological, like the SAF kind of sustainable agroforestry manner. And that one produced like twice the yield as the monoculture that we, had kind of scientifically engineered in some way. So just a good example of like, that's just business sense, right? Like that just makes more money for the producer. But on the water side, the kind of, so Sid said, we can't make an economic case for water. It's hard to. The nice thing, the opportunity is, well, in some places we can. Right. And not saying that Sid was wrong. Sid and I talk about this a lot of the time. We've talked about this many times before. In Brazil, which is where, Sid spends a lot of his time. You guys have probably all heard of the flying rivers concept in the Amazon. Pretty much the entirety of, or I think it's like 50 to 60% of rainfall in the Cerrado depends on the Amazon being intact. And so this is a lot of what I'm working on is how do you start to make that acute to businesses so they can understand what's the business value at risk under different deforestation scenarios. And I think, I was talking to a friend yesterday, I can't remember who, but in the world that we're in today, where we now know climate change is going to get worse, we're not going to hit 1.5. We probably won't hit 2. We will probably land somewhere in the 3 to 4. Hopefully not, but that's likely where we're going. I'm really curious to see if nature as resilience, nature as, infrastructure is another kind of phrase that people say, if that becomes much more of a focus for corporates to actually build out the essentially long-term efficacy of their business in the face of climate change. So I do think, we've focused for the past 100 years in the environmental movement on the bad that businesses are doing. We've never talked about how businesses depend on nature. And I think that's the big shift that we need to focus on in the next couple of years, because nature and the services it provides are becoming scarce for the first time in human history. And that's both terrible and a unique opportunity.
Cool. So this will, I wish I had another like 2 hours with both of you to dig into these things, but this will be my last, I think, question before we go to audience Q&A. And do me a favor, if you're in the audience, upvote the question that you want me to ask first. So when I quickly go through them, I haven't read all of them because I've been trying to focus, and then when I quickly go through, I can ask that question first and then sort of rank them. So just do that in the next few minutes and throughout. But my last question is kind of related to what you were talking about. Well, what both of you are talking about. And I don't often ask this like magic wand question, but I actually think in this case I want to, which is, I'm going to do it twofold. One is, what is something that you actually think that we can fix in the next 4 years, right? And we're assuming that Trump is only around for 4 years. Let's just use that. In the next 4 years, what is one fix that you think that we could actually do? And if you had the magic wand, instead I'm doing a two-part, so sorry for these complicated questions, but if you had the magic wand and you could focus on something that you're not sure if you could fix, but you wish you could, but you can be specific, what would that be? And a couple examples are like indigenous rights or focus on mangroves or something there that's like, that would really be an unlock that is harder to do, but could have a bigger positive impact. So step one, what's feasible in the short term? Step two is what's something specific that you would want to fix if you had that magic wand? And Eric, you can go first for that one.
Oh man, the time. Think. So in the short term, I mean, it's kind of gonna be the both, well, two parts of the same answer. I think water is the bridge. And honestly, I think water should be the main focus for the next 10 years if we want people to move on planetary health. I think in the next 4 years, water is where we're going to be able to make the most progress within the current administration and perspective on the value of nature and climate. I think it's also the shortest route to bring humans back into relationship with non-human nature, to see it and feel it. It's the most tangible, salient thing that humans interact with every day. And I'm going to guess, if I had to toss out a number, 90% of corporate materiality on nature is linked to water. And so, I think that's over the next 4 years where I would focus, where I'm probably am going to be focusing most of my energies. If I could wave a magic wand, we actually don't have a great understanding of the hydrological cycle, especially not how land use change and climate affects the hydrological cycle. So I think if I could wave a magic wand, which I might try to do with my Earth Fund hat on, is to try to better understand how the hydrological cycle is affected by land use change and climate, and what are the best levers that we have to change land use to ensure the hydrological cycle stays intact, and then create essentially payment mechanisms and regulatory mechanisms around that.
I just quick follow-up, Eric, to clarify, would that inherently need like a bioregionalism, like very local perspective on water, or do you think that, or you're not sure?
Well, this is I think the beauty of water is like it is from hyper local to global.
Right.
And when I like design, I spend a lot of time like designing PES mechanisms in my head because I'm a total nerd. So there are like ways to do that that's like hyper localized, and it's easier because there's less actors. But then you also look at like, well, we should probably have like a trans-jurisdictional rainfall PES mechanism where like Colombia and Peru are paying Brazil to keep the Amazon intact, and maybe even like the central US is paying Brazil because like rainfall in the US is linked to, global flows that are affected by the intactness of the Amazon. So there's many layers, and I think the challenge and opportunity is, where do we start? Because we've seen, if we start doing a global mechanism, that doesn't really work. So how do you kind of start in that smaller bioregional, like more local, which I also think is like that's one of my no regrets moves. Because worst case scenario, you're building out a bit of resilience in a place and you're like at least getting something going there, even if you're not linking it to global markets or international players. But I do think that's where we should be starting with the design and kind of deployment of these mechanisms.
Sid?
It's a tough one. I totally agree with Eric. I think one thing that I think is actionable in the next 4 years is resilience generally. I think both water is by far the biggest one, but I think fire is another one.
Yeah.
More and more. So I think both of those, and actually they're actually very closely linked. Those two pieces I think are very tangible. There is will to act. For me, it's broader than corporates. It's communities, it's governments, it's everyone, right? So it makes a ton of sense. The other piece that I think is super actionable today is just look across the way we manage land and pick out, I can name you like a dozen ways we do things that are damaging but are about to be outcompeted by better ways of doing it. And they won't fix the whole problem, but I think we can take out some of the worst and most damaging things. Like imagine telling the climate story without the fact that solar is cheaper than coal. It would be a very hard story to tell, right? And so I'm not saying that's clearly not solve the climate problem because we have a lot more stuff that's much harder. But without that story and that case study scaling across the world, we would be in much deeper trouble. And so it's almost like find the equivalent lighthouses for the way we manage land. So we can point to that and say, here's where we won. And I think we need more of those case studies. And I think it's very tangible in the food system today, which can then lay the groundwork for some of the broader transformations that we need. I think long term or kind of wave a magic wand, I think everything comes down to thinking short term rather than long term. So even the water thing, right? Eric, the payment mechanism you're describing would rely on countries thinking 5 years in advance because the water cycle isn't monthly, right? You might have long cycles of drought and then long cycles of plenty. So I think it probably sits within kind of the political economy side of things rather than nature itself. But the way we make decisions, kind of wave a magic wand so we make longer term decisions, would I think result in lots of things like this taking root.
Amazing. Okay, cool. So thank you for that. Adam, I think you had a question with the most upvotes. If you want to go first, and then I'll just cycle through the questions. And if you can go on video, I'll bring you up. Otherwise, just go off mute.
Yeah. There's been a big push in a bunch of different places in the past few years to bring IP out of the national labs because they'll like go develop something on a PhD and then it just kind of sits there forever. But a lot of places have been trying to bring that out, whether it's the DOEI cohorts, Lab Start, a bunch of other different things to try to bring out that innovation, especially when it's targeted towards climate stuff. And I was wondering if you've seen that outside of the US and then also kind of similar things.
Seen lots of it outside the US. So I was just in Australia. CSIRO in Australia has been doing the same thing, commercializing technologies, and they've built kind of different programs to help take things out of the lab. I know India pretty well, and they've done lots, particularly in the ag space, and to commercialize things that can improve yields for farmers, particularly in the smallholder context. UK set up a thing called ARIA, which is very similar to the kind of ARPA stuff, but focused on. I think this is a really promising area, but worth caveating that this is going to take a while before we see results, but it's still worth doing, absolutely.
Nothing to add. I focus more on ecological function. So maybe we need to get that science, those models out more. That's the only thing I'd say.
Cool. Thank you, Adam. John, you actually talked about energy, and it wasn't a question, but I kind of want to bring you up to kind of piece through that energy at the basis of all of this. Are you up for that?
Sure. Sorry, my video is not working for whatever reason. And I just want to make the case that I believe that if you look at the base of all economic activity, it's energy. I mean, we were until the Industrial Revolution, we were all just basically farmers and scavengers, and we lived on this planet at a standard of living that was, we lived to 35 and died. The only thing that's brought us beyond that is fossil fuel energy or energy in general. There's no reason we have to use fossil fuels. They're just and they're not cheaper than solar and wind right now. And so ultimately, we just need to continue with that transition. If it, we just need to get there because it's cheaper. And at this point, frankly, if we had good batteries, good battery tech, ultimately we would be off all fossil fuels for electricity generation. So I don't know. It's just a point of view. I don't think we can approach change with a scarcity mentality. I think that's always a loser. Nobody wants to be told that they're going to have to sacrifice. And those of us who happen to go to college in the U.S. Or be at the top of the pyramid in the rest of the world, we get ours, but you're going to need to be a subsistence farmer. It's just not going to play.
I mean, this is a fascinating, we're now starting to dip into like energy is probably boundless, with some of the technologies that we're developing today, but we still function within a bounded ecology. And I also agree with you, John. I mean, I think the majority of humans, and haven't spent a lot of time living, in countries that are at various stages of development. There is no reason why we should say you can't do what we've done. And we know that if everybody does what we've done, then we probably won't be able to all kind of co-inhabit this place. And so, I think part of this trajectory are some that have more willing to at least not try to get more than they have to allow others to come up to that level. And I don't know how this plays out. And I don't know how to engineer that in any way, shape, or form. I'm sure others have a lot more deep thoughts on that.
So do you have any thoughts on that? Sort of like prioritizing energy versus nature, I think is part of the core of the problem, the question.
I think it's absolutely true that energy is the fact that we have energy has enabled life on Earth in the way that it exists today, for us at least. I think there's a really good essay, if people are interested, by Dorian Sagan and Lynn Margulis on Gaia theory. It was written in the 1980s, but worth reading again because it actually, I think, does a really good job of laying out how consumption of resources, including energy, sits within a much wider history of life on Earth as kind of inherently over-consuming resources and then dying out. And it's a philosophical essay, but it's also a kind of ecological theory that was partially proven over time. But you're right. I mean, I think we need to break that cycle. And for the first time, we have some of the technologies that could help us do that. Because until this point, it's always been photosynthetic output is the only way we can create energy on Earth. So that's definitely something we should think about. But the link to climate for me is nature can help obviously solve the climate crisis in some ways, but it is, as Eric said, also its own thing. And there are levers that we can apply, in particular on water and kind of access to nature, that have nothing to do with energy, but have everything to do with the way people kind of look to build fulfilling lives that they're excited about. And so I think we should use it. We should join them up where it's relevant, but I do actually recommend keeping them separate where it's not, because we may make more progress that way.
I would just add that cities are much more economic or ecologically good for the world, than rural inhabitation or habitation. If we were all in coastal cities or we are all in cities, we wouldn't have much pressure at all on the natural resources. So it's anti-intuitive, right? As long as we don't use more stuff, if we can basically produce more experience and make human life better, as long as energy is basically free and boundless. And it's not going to be free, but it is boundless. I mean, there's more than enough, like, solar that hits the earth on a single day to power all our needs for an entire year.
Yeah, John, I'm gonna have to. I'm gonna I'll go to the next person just because I'm conscious of time. And I think there are interesting things about like the mineral use and the resource use of energy that I don't know enough about, but that could maybe be a separate conversation actually, because I like where we're going with that tension of energy, resources, water. And I think there's something really to pull out there. But let's talk about who we should bring in, John, for that conversation. And then Kevin, I'll have you probably ask the last question.
Eric, Sid, thank you for your time today. Good to see you again, Eric. Just one side note in terms of when we deal with the problems and such, I've been a big practitioner of keeping this on my desk every day. My only thing where I depart from stoicism is it appears at times it can have a bit of a lack of action. So I kind of go stoicism plus a bias for action versus just sitting back, good in your head. That's not my question, just I'd throw that in there. Donut economics, can you talk to that a bit? It had, at least in my separated circles, a hot minute, and I'm on their site now, and they continue to have events, but I'm wondering if that, caught some fire and had a bit of recency bias that everyone's talking about it, but it touches on water, it touches on biodiversity, even to a degree gets to the spirit of self, the social foundations of humanity, et cetera. So I'm just curious if you guys have any comments as to that. It looks like there's still active movements, but I've not seen anything breach over into the public sector or the private sector in any organizational sense.
I haven't either, Kevin. I mean, it's a disappointment and a shame, but it has not had the impact I hoped it would.
Yeah, I remember reading first in 2018 and thinking like this is the next step, very clearly, but it has not translated, and I'm not sure. I'm not sure why. I mean, Oxford, Sid, you can, better than me, but Oxford seems to be the most progressive kind of thinking that I've seen in the academic world around some of this stuff. But I haven't seen it move really beyond academia in a lot of ways.
All right.
And is it DONUT or DOUGHNUT? That might be the barrier.
We need the Simpsons donut. We got to simplify. Right.
Kevin. All right. I think I'm going to take, Jessica, you had a similar comment, but I'm going to take it as a question and then round it out, which is kind of what is the story for corporates? Like, what is it essentially? Nature has a value that you're not paying right now, but you will pay soon. And so you should protect it so you pay less in the future. Is that like, refine that story for me so we can all understand that better.
Maybe Sid, do you want to do like on farm and I'll do off farm, essentially?
Yeah, perfect. And I think they both link, obviously, but I think for any corporate that relies on food or fiber, which we directly source from nature, nature is the only way we can produce these things, and those things are struggling. The current systems are struggling. I think the way we approach it is very much to say, if you believe in any business model that relies on sourcing food or fiber, you should be thinking about the sustainability of that and how you can secure that for even the short term. Unfortunately, again, the trouble is always short term versus long term, and kind of how corporates are rewarded for action. But I still think it's possible to do this in a way that makes sense, even in the kind of annual reporting cycle. So that to me makes a lot of sense. I don't think voluntary action on its own scales. Because there's not been. I think there have been a few things with really sustained political pressure and social pressure that have sustained, but as you see, like when political shifts happen, corporates in some ways have to move with it, and then some of them try their best to hold on, and others actually are very gladly moving on from things they committed to. So I think it's either it needs to make sense on its own, or it needs to be incredibly stable regulation. So depending on where you are in the world, I think one of those two.
Yeah. And I just added that I think, like since when that doesn't make economic sense to shift from, this chemical pesticide to a biologic, and is there a business case for it? And it's the same thing with, essentially, is there a business case to protect and restore ecosystems upon which you have a hydrological dependency? And so I know it's crazy, never thought I'd hear myself saying this, but I'm not focused at all on impact right now. 100% of my focus is on dependency. How do you make the business case? And then how you translate that to collective action is the big question that I'm kind of tinkering with right now, which is if you have 10 corporates that are all dependent on one landscape, how do you get them to move together? And my plan right now is you hopefully get the biggest three that have the biggest dependence. You get them to be able to start saying, oh shit, we need to do something about this, and go to the government and actually say, we want you to regulate all 10 of us so that we all have to move together and therefore all benefit from it. So that's my very, loose and quick playbook to try to do in a bunch of different places. We'll see how it translates.
Are there any comparables in other industries, Eric, that you're working off of?
I mean, water funds is like the closest example of this, but it's normally only done with like one or two entities, and it's done around water quality. Usually we have like one basin with like one major entity like Coca-Cola or InBev that have a dependency. Then we need to get to the like V2 of payment for ecosystem service mechanisms, where you have many actors involved, 5 to 20 to 30, and they're all coming in on a collective mechanism. And the key here is they're not going to do it if there's just a potential loss. You need to make the immediate ROI, which is how do you translate that potential loss being mitigated to an immediate like credit rating boost for the company, or like the shareholder, the share price of the stock goes up because all the investors are looking at the reduced risk. Like that's the translation, the positive kind of ROI story that we really need to nail, or it's never going to go organically. We're going to have to keep brute forcing it.
Cool. Well, we're right on the hour, and I don't want to make anyone late for the next thing. Sid, Eric, thank you so much. Let's keep in touch, obviously, on how things are going and how we can be helpful. But thank you again for taking the time with us.
Thanks for having us, Kendall.
That's great.
Thanks, everyone. We'll see you. If you want to go off mute and say thank you, you're welcome to. But we'll see you soon.
Thank you
Thanks.
so much, guys.
Thank you, guys.